You're tapped in with the Questions Hip Hop Podcast. Every week, I'm providing deep discussions, thought exercises, debates, conversations about hip hop, its culture, its music, with its practitioners, its fans, and everything in between. My name is Sean Kantrowitz, and this week, I am joined by someone who we were just speaking off camera. I'm not only intrigued to talk about his latest work, which is independent as fuck, underground hip hop from 1995 to 2005, an expansive and comprehensive resource almanac of a great deal of incredibly, world impacting music, but also just the fact that this guy is a fellow internet rap archivist. There's no other better way to say it. This guy has an unhealthy obsession with hip hop music in the same way that I do. So I'm really looking forward to conversing with you. We got Ben Pedroche on the questions today. Ben, what's up?
Hey, Sean. Nice to be here. And yeah, thank you for the very kind introduction there.
Absolutely. So, Ben, let's talk about the book first and foremost. Independent as Fuck, Underground Hip Hop from 1995 to 2005. What was sort of the impetus that made you decide? I'm curious. I know you've published a few books before, but this is the first one that is focused on hip hop music. Am I correct?
Absolutely correct. Yeah. So randomly, I've published a few other books, but they're about London history. I'm from the UK, and like London history is completely unconnected to hip hop. It's pretty random. But hip hop is the thing that's been, consuming my life for the last 30 years. I used to write for a lot of hip hop magazines back in the past, like Hip Hop Connection, which even people from the US know as being kind of like, the longest running hip hop magazine, even before The Source and things like that. It was a legendary UK publication. So I used to write for those and a few other magazines. I had my website, Grown Up Rap, which I'm sure some of your followers will be familiar with. But I never really found the right kind of hook to write hip hop book. And that was always my dream, to write my first book about hip hop. So I kind of came up with this idea. That whole indie era is my sweet spot. I'm kind of a 90s, early 90s boom bap kid / second half of the 90s indie kid. So yeah, I kind of came up with this idea, connected with a really good publisher who publishes some really cool books about music history. And it all kind of just snowballed from there, really.
I'm always curious for people. I was born in New York. I really grew up in South Florida, which in many ways has been, unofficially dubbed the sixth borough because there were so many transplants who went down there. And, I've lived in Los Angeles for the last decade plus. So all of our relationship to music is so different. And hip hop is obviously very global, but for the most part, your book and the understanding of it as an American art form is that clearly it was coming from the States. So, your perspective, how are you getting music? Like, what was sort of your relationship to what was an American Black art form coming, across the pond? How were you receiving it? Were you sort of, was it in real time? Were you coming up on things, sort of out of order? I'm always curious about that relationship as a listener and as a fan.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question in 2025, where obviously music is completely global. It's all online. We have access to everything instantly. But we're talking about, kind of 95 onwards. I started liking hip hop in very late 1992, early 1993. And yeah, it definitely was not in real time. That was the era pre-internet. By the time the indie era came along, internet was a thing, but it wasn't anything like today. There was no social media. So it definitely wasn't in real time. So I was getting my information from magazines. So as I say, Hip Hop Connection, which were really up on the UK stuff, but also all the American stuff. And then, obviously Source and Double XL and all those magazines. So you saw an album and, an advertisement for an album. Hey, it was coming out on this date. You go to the shop and you buy it. And I was getting my indie rap records from 12 inches from the record stores in the city where I come from, Nottingham. I live in London now. I've been living here for many years, but I'm originally from Nottingham, who most people in the US know for Robin Hood, right? So there was record shops in my city, and I was going buying 12-inch records, indie hip hop 12 inches every week without fail. And it's kind of just, getting that information from the magazine and then seeing a label and knowing that you're going to like whatever that, like Raucous, for example, right? If you buy one Raucous and the next week there's something else on Raucous, I know I'm going to like it. So it's just kind of that way, which in some ways is actually way more exciting than now, because like now it's kind of overload and everything's there and you don't have to do the work. Whereas in that era, you really had to go and do your research, and it was hard to do that research because it wasn't, readily accessible. So it was kind of more fun discovering, and it was that sense of kind of, when you're sort of part of a subculture, you feel like you found your home, but also you feel like you're part of this special club. It really felt more like that back then because, as I say, you really had to go and hunt for this kind of entry to this special club. So it was a really exciting time, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you had to hunt for it, but also you had to be discerning with your decisions because everything wasn't essentially free.
Yeah,
It wasn't the investment of listening to an album now is, do I want to move my thumb from where it is here to tap it over here? And then I can peruse it and I can come back to it. Whereas the economy of walking into a store, not really being able to preview and having to make a decision and having to live with that decision, that plays a huge part, I believe, in our relationship as listeners to music. 100%.
absolutely. And the financial dedication, commitment as well. I would have been kind of 16, 17, 18 buying these records. And a 12-inch record in indie record in the UK, because obviously it's all imported, right? So it would have been like £6.50, which is probably what, like, I don't know, seven or something dollars.
Yeah.
The average album, I'd never bought any indie stuff on albums on vinyl. I used to buy albums on CD, and
Yeah.
single was 12 inches, obviously on wax. The average CD album was about maybe 12, 14 pounds. So what, maybe like $15, $14 or whatever. But imported stuff could be like £18, which is quite a lot. So as well as the time, yes, you really had to, and this is like, if I'm a teenager at this point, 17, I'm not earning money, I don't have much, just money from my parents or whatever. So yeah, it was a real big decision.
Yeah, I can relate as well. Just know that it was going on both sides because in the U.S., of course, a lot of artists, even if they were domestic artists, would put out import singles that had bonus songs. So I was going to the mall and sometimes dropping $18, $19 on a maxi single that had maybe one song that I didn't know what it was going to sound like, and hoping that this one song was worth $18. Usually wasn't, but there was some good exploration to be had there.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you sort of touch upon your initial entry point into this in the beginning chapter of the book, talking about your personal relationship. But largely, the book doesn't really tackle things from your personal perspective. It's really a bit more, I guess the word I would say is just matter of fact. There's not a lot of your personal perspective put onto the book. I wonder, was this always the case? Did you ever consider taking more of a lens through you as the listener, or did you sort of want it to be more of a tool for people to sort of get like the facts, the history, the timeline derived strictly from a historical perspective? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. What you've just said there. So it was the second one. So yeah, I kind of wanted. At first, I did actually plan to write the whole thing in first person, but
Yeah.
ultimately, I didn't kind of want it. I'm a very opinionated guy, especially when it comes to hip hop. And I
Yeah.
didn't want to kind of like. I didn't want to make it self-indulgent where it was just like me, kind of like ranting or waxing lyrical about something. So I kind of switched to make the intro is the only bit that's in first person. You're 100% correct. And that is a bit more personal about my journey. But yes, the rest, I wanted to make it kind of a completely accessible kind of historical reference tool where people didn't have to concern themselves with my personal opinion. I just kind of wanted to keep it straight down the line. So yeah, but as you say, the intro needed to be personal because that was my kind of like journey into that. So yeah,
Sure.
that was the driving decision.
So what was the process like, in terms of start to finish? How did you sort of begin? I know that you sort of outline in the early, start of it after you go through the personal context, sort of set the parameters and explaining why you're covering and what you are covering and what you aren't covering. But I'm just curious, from a writer's perspective, how did you sort of go about tackling what is clearly, this is a comprehensive book, and even still, there were things that you had to pick and choose what you were going to focus on and what you were not going to. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so at first the plan was more expensive. So originally I was going to kind of cover not that 10-year period, kind of. I mean, 1995 is when that kind of whole underground era kind of kicked off. So I knew I didn't want to go kind of before 95, apart from for context, which, as you say, I do that in one of the early chapters. But originally I was going to go from 1995 to now, and originally as well, I also wanted to include indie hip hop from the UK and France and Japan and all these other countries that have a rich scene that was going on kind of, in parallel to what was happening in the US and Canada. But I quickly realized it would have been too sprawling, right? It would have been too kind of like epic. And I think I would have spread myself too thin, basically, and it would have kind of like ran out of steam somewhere. So then I focused on that 10-year period. So that, in terms of structure, really gave me the kind of, okay, here's every artist I want to include. I can't include these because they're outside of the thing. So then I started structuring it, and kind of, you've seen in the book, I kind of structure it geographically. So obviously East Coast and West Coast, and then all the other areas. And then I look at record labels, and then key albums and key 12 inches. So once I got that structure, it made sense. Another reason why I changed my mind about including things like the UK as well, because most of your listeners will know that independent as fuck was like a mantra that came out of that whole period. It's like printed in big letters in the Funk Crusher Plus album artwork. And it became sort of like the battle cry, right? And a big crux of the book is that kind of indie versus the mainstream, kind of indie do-it-yourself versus the mainstream mega labels. For something like the UK, and it would have been the same for Germany, Poland, whatever, basically until like the last 10 years where people like Stormzy or grime artists have become big, before then, essentially every bit of hip hop from the UK was independent because no label, there was never any major label backing. Right. So my point is, I couldn't really in the end include something like the UK because I couldn't make that argument of us versus them, independent as fuck. I couldn't do that for the UK because it wouldn't make sense. So that was another driving decision why I decided ultimately to hone it in on North America. And for obvious reasons, right? 90% of this music that was so great was from the US and Canada. So it made sense from that perspective as well.
When did you start writing the book?
So it took about just under a year altogether. So I had to submit it to the publisher in January. So it would have been kind of late 2023, something like that. So yeah, it took about a year, just under a year. Which is kind of good for me. I kind of gave myself a deadline because if I don't, I would have like, procrastinated for ages. So I'm kind of glad I got it done. So
becomes the detox of indie hip hop books. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How do you go about doing this? Do you outline? Do you sort of and were you sort of writing it in chronological order? I really am interested in the process.
Yeah, for some things like the kind of pre-1995 section that you mentioned, that was in chronological order. The rest was kind of a little bit all over the place. It was more geographical than chronological, and then I kind of put each geographical region into that chronological order. But it's also kind of the big sections like the New York and the West Coast sections. It's more kind of prominence of artists. Like in the New York section, I begin with Kool Keith because even though Kool Keith was from that older era, he was one of the driving forces of that kind of indie New York rap. And then soon after that, you'll have to move on to Doom, and you have to move on to Mos Def, and you have to move on to LP. So that was kind of more prominence rather than chronological. But then after that, it got kind of a bit more chronological in sort of time order. So, but the eras kind of flip around, so it's not that easy to do it in a logical, linear fashion. So it was kind of all over the place, but yeah, more geographical, really.
Saw that you gave a shout out to Dart Adams, former guest on the show here, and the man that we all think twice before we post anything relating to a date on the internet because he is very much here to fact check. Tell me about his involvement in the project. Was he brought in early on, or did he sort of do a pass towards the end once you had a pretty much finished draft?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to get it fact checked because I knew a lot of this stuff anyway from being a fan. I did a shitload of research, but it's always kind of the biggest challenge was finding consistent details on some of the more obscure artists. Kind of like if it's just some random Discogs page, you never know whether it's true. So I knew I wanted to get it fact checked, and as you say, we're always scared to put anything online because we know that Dart's going to pick us up on it, right? Which he
Yeah.
has done many times with my rap history tweets that I did. And I've always corrected it, by the way, and I've always given him shout outs for putting me right. So I knew I wanted to get fact checked, and I can't think of anyone more perfect than him. Yeah, so I brought him on quite early because I wanted to kind of get his feedback on the scope and what he thought of it. And then yes, when the final draft was done, then I handed it to him, and he gave a very thorough fact check. There wasn't many things that I had to fix, which was great, especially with the Boston section. He's like really passionate about Boston. I was kind of like shitting myself and that was going to be completely wrong, but it was fine. But no, he was an amazing help and great to work with. So yeah, he gave me not only the facts, but he gave me some kind of really good pointers as well, that including kind of like a couple of personal details, about a couple of certain artists that if I had missed, I would have been really kind of annoyed with myself. So yeah, really great guy, really good to work with. So
Yeah,
I'm really glad I did that.
there's a lot of pressure, that exists when you're presenting something that is, definitive. You feel that immense pressure that you don't want to get things wrong. You want to make sure that you're representing all things correctly and that that everything's factually correct. So I imagine that you probably revised and went through this many times before you even let anybody else see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I did it. And as you say, it's not only pressure because you know that the hip hop heads will pile on you if you get it wrong, but it's also when you're talking about people's personal stories as well. Like I've been, if I'm talking about how the Juggernauts came into the scene, and you want to get it right because you're literally talking about people's life stories. So yeah, there was a bit of pressure, but with Dart's help and the feedback that I've got to some of the artists that I've sent it to, I'm kind of fairly confident that I've got everything correct. So
Yeah.
it's a huge relief.
I'm curious, what sort of we spoke earlier about the dichotomy between independent, basically a lot of what defined independent hip hop in some broad strokes was just the fact that it wasn't commercial, that it wasn't mainstream. Obviously, there were some sonic aesthetic definitions that you could also lump that, but it very much was this dichotomy between the Davids and the Goliaths, right? Which now seems like such an antiquated. In a way, everything has been democratized and equalized because distribution has just changed. Obviously, you see artists who are able to do things outside of just the production of records because they're funded. Whether it's tours or any kind of like branding initiatives or things. Money still matters, is what I'm saying. But in the rearview mirror, I'm curious what your sort of relationship is with all of this music, because there's a lot of underground records that I really loved in my formative years that now they don't necessarily connect with me in the same way. And I imagine that you were revisiting a lot of this stuff in the process of writing the book. So I'm curious to know what your sort of perspective is all of these years later on this particular era.
Yeah, the vast majority of it, I still really love. I mean, I still listen to it anyway, So, the kind of, but you are correct. A lot of it is quite dated, and there's a lot of kind of Illuminati conspiracy type theory shit that now, yeah, to be honest, it sounded cheesy at the time. It sounded like corny at the time, but now it sounds like super corny and like really, you know what I mean? And obviously now kind of like it's not a million steps away from like Trump and MAGA and all that kind of stuff. So it kind of like, it feels like kind of like there's that element as well that's dated it like really. Some of it was not quite as dope as I remembered either. Like, kind of like at the time, some stuff sounded really fresh and now it doesn't. But for the most part, yeah, most of it has aged very well and it still sounds amazing today. So that's good.
If you had to distill, this is a tough question, but what were the 3 indie records that sort of go on your Mount Rushmore, or 3 or 4 that are in the Hall of Fame, sort of definitive, important records to you personally? You don't have to speak on behalf of indie listeners, worldwide, but for Ben's story, what are the 3 or 4 records that really move the needle?
Yeah, I mean, for me, some of these choices are the obvious ones, but they're obvious for a reason because they're so great. So, in terms of actual songs, not albums, Fire in Which You Burn, Company Flow, Indelible MCs. Again, it's an obvious pick, but it is just that whole album, the Funk Crusher Plus album, completely sums up not only the kind of David versus Goliath battle that you mentioned, but also the aesthetic sound of Underground, especially from New York. That album sums it up perfectly. And that particular song, you have Breeze Brewin and you have Jay Treads and you have LP. That's probably, in my mind, that's LP's finest verse. And, it's and obviously Big Juss, and it's the production is so weird. So that's an unobvious choice, but for me, it's a great one. Another one would be Dr. Octagon, Blue Flowers. For me, that's good. I played that record so much, and I still do today.
Yeah.
Obviously Doom. So for me, kind of, as much as Mad Villainy is great, I actually still like Operation Doomsday better. And the actual Doomsday song is just, the Doom's flow on that is just so kind of like perfect, and it's so kind of like grimy and sort of like, anyway, it's amazing. People on the Stairs, Acid Raindrops is another one that just kind of, for me personally, just does something to me. Like as soon as you hear that kind of like that intro start, it gives me the feel. So yeah, things like that. There's so many I could name, but there's some of the big ones. Yeah,
good picks. Those are good picks. So okay, we've spoken about the book at length here, but what I also am really curious about is you run social media channels, Grown Up Rap. I'm fascinated by. Let me even take it back. When I was, starting the questions, it was simultaneously a live event that I was doing, and then we also were leaning into, okay, we're always going to promote the events that we're doing in Los Angeles, but what other content can we do? And sort of looking at other channels like yourself that were basically commemorating and giving a on this date in history, celebrating milestones such as the albums, birthdays, monumental calendar events, because it's really interesting and fascinating to see all these things, seeing how they line up. There was this one day in this year where all of these albums came out. You think about what was that year in 1998 when it was Black Star, Aquemini, Jay-Z, Brand Nubian, and Tribe, right? It's insane. Or Slim Shady LP and The Roots Things Fall Apart coming out on the same day is another one that sticks out in my head. That
or Large Pro and Premier having the same birthday as well. Not the same year, but the same birthday, yeah.
Right. So my first question is, when did you start Grown Up Rap, and what did it begin with, and how did it sort of become the practice that it is today? And then I have a second question that's more personal about that, but yeah.
Yeah, so I started it's over 10 years ago now. I'm just checking myself now. When I'm literally checking now. So my Twitter page started in 2014. Yeah, so it's like 11 years ago.
Wow.
And basically, it's all a hobby. I don't monetize any of the content on Twitter or Instagram at all. It's a hobby. It's what I do for fun, right? It was coming at a time. So my first child was born in 2015. So it was possibly around the time my wife was pregnant with our first child. And I was focusing on family, and I kind of felt like I was losing sort of like something that was personal to me. So, I thought, and I've never stopped listening to hip hop, but I did go for a few years before I started the blog where I was a little bit more kind of stuck in the classic stuff and not as in touch with the modern hip hop, the modern stuff that's coming out. So I wanted to get back into that. But yeah, I think part of it was I kind of wanted something that was separate to family and kids, and that was my own hobby. So I kind of like really sort of dived back into that whole kind of scene and really kind of got myself back into it. But yeah, it was just a hobby. It's just something to pass the time. I spend too much time on it. My wife's always telling me that I'm on Twitter and Instagram way too much, and she's right. But yeah, it was just kind of like a passion project, really, just kind of something just for the hell of it. And And you know what? The history tweets, they get a really big uh, response. And it's only stuff that is my kind of hip hop. I don't do like, Puff Daddy was born. Well, that's a bad example, but you know what I mean? It's the kind of hip hop that I like. I'll only do the history things on, and it's the hip hop that I know that my followers like as well. But
Mm.
the response that it gets really kind of makes it worth the while as well, even though it's just a hobby. But like to hear it stimulates conversation, and people say, "Oh, I hadn't heard this album for years. Thanks for reminding me." "Oh, I've never heard this album. Thanks. I've just listened to it now. It's amazing." So I love that feedback. But yeah, it's ultimately just kind of a hobby. So
Yeah. So, okay, that brings me to my second question. How the hell are you still continuing to do this? Because from my personal perspective, it is such a consuming thing that I'm just curious how you parse out your day because there's so much hip hop history at this point. And in full disclosure, I eventually just decided, like, man, I don't know that I want to continue to dedicating my pages just to that. And so now the questions has largely become just about the episodes and the events that we're doing. And if there are certain things that are happening in real time, we will. But I'm asking more just out of awe and respect because essentially I'm saluting you because I just felt so overwhelmed by trying to hang with the grown up raps and on this day in hip hop, pages. I just was like, man, this is a lot. So I'm just curious. Are you scheduling a lot of things? Are you sort of, do you have a routine, like part of your day that, okay, I'm going to carve out this hour, I'm going to do my posts, write them and post them. Tell me about this process.
yeah, no, I actually don't know how I do it, to be honest. It's all by hand every day. So basically, so I have two kids, I have a full-time job, so I don't have a lot of spare time, right? So the book, if we go back to the book for a second, I used to write the book in the night times when the kids were in bed and wife was in bed or whatever. So that was tiring as it is, and then get up the next day and do a full day's work.
Yeah.
In terms of the content stuff, so I've been building this database over the last like 10 years of these history dates. So I have this kind of like Excel sheet that I use, but I do it by hand every day. And it's, yeah, there is a schedule. So basically, it's kind of weird. Like I usually do the history, prepare the rap history tweets, and I do it on IG as well on the way home from the day job on the train on the ride home. I do that, and then I post them kind of like just when the kids have gone to bed. And you know what's funny? Sometimes if there's a day when I'm busy or like I'm sick or whatever, and I haven't done it at the usual time, some people actually tweet me and say, where's today's history tweet? It's like, which is like flattering, but like, yeah, I fit it in when I can, basically. And yes, there are times when I spend too much time on my phone. But no, I don't schedule stuff in advance. Oh yeah, I post new music as well on a Friday. I just posted those like about 30 minutes ago. Yeah, I don't know how I do it, to be honest. It's hard. It's a grind. But like I say, no one's asking me to do it. It's purely for fun. I could stop at any time, and obviously the world will keep spinning. But I kind of feel like I can't stop now. Not because I feel like anybody's waiting for it, but because like it's so part of my schedule, my routine, that it's come second nature to me now. So yeah.
Yeah, it's like part of your identity. So my question
Yeah.
would also be, you have thousands, not millions of followers, but you have a very dedicated following. And I see these posts, I see the tweets, or I see the Instagram posts, and I see the engagements. My question to you is, in the world, I don't know how often you're going to shows these days. Obviously, a lot of these artists, if they are performing in the area, it's not like a lot of them are local. Have you ever had a moment of recognition, like, hey, I'm grown up rap, like I'm the grown up rap guy, or even with fans or listeners, because I think, yes, to the broader scope, it's not saying like, hey, I work with Beyonce. That's going to like 9 out of 10 times get a really big reaction. It's perhaps less, but I feel like for the right demographic, if they were to be like, oh, you're the grown up rap guy? Holy shit. I'm just curious. Have you had any of those moments?
Yeah, a couple of times. I usually kind of, because I do, again, because of the kids, I don't get to go to live hip hop shows as much as I used to, but I do kind of like, for example, like I've just booked tickets to go and see Evidence for like the 50th time because he's coming to London in like August. So I think, I do kind of go and see like, my favorite artists. And I usually get talking to someone and they'll go, oh yeah, oh my God, I follow you. So they do know. And I've been doing these kind of like book launch events over the last month or so over the UK where I'm going like doing, Q&As and selling copies of the book. And there's always people there who know me from a grown up rap. There was one time when it did happen. This is awesome. you remember when Stretch and Bobbito released their documentary,
Yeah,
Radio
of
That
course.
Changed Lives? So they came over to the UK to promote it, and they did a couple of like Q&A sessions. And then I went to one, and the next day in London, randomly, I just walked by Stretch and Bob, and like they were on their way to like a radio interview, and I said, I had a little chat with them, and I said, "Oh, I do this grown-up rap," and Stretch was like, "Oh, girl, oh, you do that? That's you." And I'm like, "Oh, wow!" Like Stretch Armstrong has seen my tweets. That's awesome. But no, that's the one time it's happened. So yeah,
That's amazing. That's such again, like I'm saying, it's not a household name, but it's a very important name to people who are dialed into this. Certainly, almost everyone who's probably going to watch or hear this when this interview comes out. So I'm
yeah.
just always
Actually,
curious about that.
it's just reminded me of something else. Actually, so Ice-T follows me on Twitter,
Okay,
which is, Ice-T is really good at Twitter, right? He's very good at what he does. And randomly he follows me. I'm just checking now. He follows 1,819 people. He's got 1.8 million followers. He follows me on Twitter, and sometimes he'll react, like he will genuinely like interact and engage with the tweets. The other day, one of my history tweets was for his was it one of his later albums. And I looked later on, and he'd actually copied and pasted the exact my history tweet and posted on his feed, and like didn't credit it. I'm like, I don't care. I'm not gonna like I'm not gonna like complain to Ice-T, but it was flattering. But like he literally took the exact post and posted it on his timeline. So that was pretty cool. But now he does follow me, and he does legitimately like and sometimes retweet some of my stuff. So that's quite
amazing.
flattering as well. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. So what's next? I know that you said that you had done some promo and Q&A for the book. What's next on the campaign for that? Obviously, you're doing a lot of interviews and things now. And then I'm curious, even beyond that, what do you see as your next project? I know you just wrapped this book. It's taken up, months and hours and years of your life. But I'm just curious to know what you have coming up down the pipeline.
Sure. Yeah. So we've got more of these launch events coming soon. There's one in London in a few weeks. Probably not super relevant to most of your followers, but for the London heads, that's coming up later this month. And then there's going to be some others as well around the UK. So that's that. Obviously, I'm promoting the hell out of the book at the moment. That's one good thing about having built up a following on Twitter and Instagram. It means I can kind of like use it. I have to be careful because I don't want to kind of like bombard people and make it look like, oh, now he's pivoting to promoting his book. I'm still doing all the stuff I did before, but obviously it makes sense for me to, use those channels to promote the book. So I'm doing that. Next.
And also, I would say certainly you've been for over a decade essentially creating content in post
Exactly.
where you're not trying
Yeah.
to sell anything. I think even if
Exactly,
you
yeah.
took a few weeks to just focus on, hey, this is something that I'm putting out that now you can support, I don't think that would be
Sure.
the worst thing in the world. But
Exactly.
anyway,
And ultimately, it's my account. If you don't like it, don't unfollow me, basically.
yeah.
After that, so basically, I mentioned earlier on the books I'd written before about London. There's a huge gap between the last one of those and this book. And I kind of like lost my passion for the writing of books a little bit, but this has really sort of like reignited that.
Hmm.
So, and I really want to write another hip hop book. I just got to find the right idea. A couple of people said, well, if you do that 10-year period, you could do a second one about the following 10-year period. I don't think there's enough juicy stuff to write about, but maybe. But no, I've got kind of a few ideas that I want to kind of like play around with and get them out of my head and onto paper. So yeah, hopefully start work on another big project soon. And other than that, yeah, just plugging away at the curation that we talked about, and yeah, seeing what happens.
The grind never stops when it comes to the grown
Absolutely.
up rap and archiving and documenting history of hip hop. Ben, appreciate you so much. Thank you again for joining the show. We'll put links in the bio for you all to check out Ben's book, follow Grown Up Rap. Again, the book is Independent as Fuck, Underground Hip Hop from 1995 to 2005. And appreciate you. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Sean. It was great to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Likewise.